All right, we're recording, we're live.
Cool. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this second discussion between me and Mshary. The first discussion, we talked about the objectivity or subjectivity of reality. And in this discussion, we'd like to explore the nature of morality. Is it absolute? Is it objective? What's the nature of morality? And then we'll go on to explore specific issues related to morality. Nice to be with you, Mshary, again.
Likewise.
Okay, so would you like to take the lead in terms of giving your personal definition or your personal understanding of what morality is?
So, morality, it's pretty vague. So let me say something about like one perspective of the origin of the idea of morality.
Mhm.
So I think there was like this thought experiment or something. Honestly, I wish I remember the resources, but I learned it from Jordan Peterson, I think. But anyway, so the idea is, let's say that you are trapped or stuck in in an island, and you're alone in the island. So there's in the island there's enough resources to sustain you, and then eventually another person uh, finds their way into the island. But now there might not be enough resources for, for the both of you. So then the question becomes, how do you act? How do you divide the resources that makes it fit the both of you, and make everybody okay with the situation, and be able to survive? That becomes the question. And the answer to that is morality, is what's right and what's wrong, you know? It's basically how you act that makes it okay for everyone else to live, so that you don't take what's not rightfully yours. So like stealing someone else's property, that's clearly wrong, because then it's not an even distribution that's okay for everyone else. And the topic of like food resources, that's pretty easy to define and to distribute. It's pretty clear what the resource itself is. It's going to be food, and as long as you're not hungry and you can keep staying alive, then we're in the bounds of morality, let's say. But the way this translates into real life is where the complexity and the ambiguity and the vagueness come into the picture. uh, it's not clear what the resource in life is. You know, some people might think it's money. So as long as money is divided or distributed fairly, then we're doing the right thing. But then people are unhappy in spite of that. So then there's another thing. Maybe it's happiness or trust, which is the other resource that's not distributed evenly and fairly. Not evenly, but fairly. Um, so the one way you can think of morality is that how can you how can you act in a way that if everybody else acts the same way, um, then everyone would be okay. Everyone would be satisfied and happy with the results of the way that the whole society or social group acts and behaves in. I think that's kind of related to another philosopher's perspective on morality, which is that how can you act in a way that if everybody else acts the same way, then it's good. It's related to that, Ian. Um, but
Okay.
my personal perspective on morality itself is it's really similar to this, but it's the way that I take it to guide my decisions and tell me what's right and what's wrong is um, is basically if I'm creating abundance in my own life and wealth in my own life without taking from someone else. If I'm taking from someone else, let's say, if what makes me happy would also if it makes me happy by making someone else miserable, that's wrong. It goes against the tides of morality, the waves of morality. It goes against the grain of morality. The right thing to do would be should result in abundance of happiness and safety and peace in my own self, without taking from someone else happiness and peace and safety and so on. So I guess I'm seeing it from the perspective of the results rather than the process.
Okay. I think you touched on quite a few interesting points. The way I see morality is, if we take just a step back, my impression is what you shared in terms of a definition, which is how can you act in a way that if everyone was to act in the same way, uh, everyone would benefit. Would that be a good uh,
Yes.
way
Yes.
to express it? Okay. This, I believe, is not only the definition of morality, but it leans towards a specific um, way in which morality is expressed. Because the way I see morality is that um, it's the way each one of us decides the actions that uh, we ought to take, or the actions that we will take. Okay, so with that definition, so anything that guides decision making is part of our moral system. And the reason why I define it this way is because even those who do bad things are driven by uh, moral conviction. So I don't believe, um, I'll get to this point later, but uh, it's not really a distinction between who is moral and who is um, immoral. It's what is initially, what kind of morals are we living by? Okay, because it's important to acknowledge that even those who do bad things believe they're doing the right thing. Okay, and if you look at the definition of fairness, a capitalist would use the word fairness in almost the exact opposite meaning of fairness to a communist. So there's there's misunderstanding of what fairness actually is. What is the goal that we're seeking? So broadly speaking, morality is any attempt at uh, like any sort of heuristic or any values that guide our decision making. And then, so that's broadly speaking. But then, um, good, like the morality we should seek is one that is for the betterment of all. Because if you look at like the different approaches to morality, one approach would say, for example, Immanuel Kant would say you have to be like anything that you do for yourself is by default immoral because you're being selfish. But then you have Aristotle who frames morality around uh, self-interest. So when you seek self-interest, you are actually being moral. Utilitarians would say it's for the betterment of the majority, not for the betterment of everyone, but as long as it benefits the majority, then it's a moral thing. So then we come to the actually defining what is the good. And that is another discussion in and of itself. But I do believe it's important to acknowledge that there are different interpretations of morality to begin with. It's not just um, trying to seek the benefit of all, because fairness, again, is open to interpretation.
It's really interesting there. So the first part about basically defining morality, you said how morality is kind of like the thing that guides your decision making in the process. Is that right?
Yes.
So yes, I completely agree with that, and it becomes kind of like a code. But I think the thing behind that that guides our decision making is our values, is what do we value, and that's kind of what guides our decision making.
Yes,
Um,
exactly. And sometimes, like, there was, I can't remember who. came up with this sort of approach or this understanding of morality, but that morality is the story we tell ourselves after the fact. So you take an action, and then how can you justify the action to yourself? You come up with a moral story. I think there's an element of truth in it. I think there's like a feedback loop, but initially there's something that led you to act the way you acted in the first place. I think people do behave differently in the same given situation. And the reason why they behave differently is how they define what morality is. Not necessarily on a conscious level, sometimes implicitly, like you get angry at someone because he treated you with disrespect. It's part of your moral system to justify you lashing out against them because they caused you offense. And that is part of your practical moral code. It's not something that you're claiming to follow. It's what your body is actually driving you towards. It's the action that you will take given the opportunity, So there's more to morality than just the story we tell ourselves. Values do guide our actions. I think that's a really important point to make. But then if you look at, for example, religious individuals and then sort of liberal individuals, some people would say live and let live, each person gets to decide their own lifestyle. But then other people would say you shouldn't allow immoral behavior within society. Both of them believe that they're doing the right thing, but that doesn't mean, just because their intentions are good, doesn't mean that what they act on is good or will lead to the outcome that they want.
Yeah, definitely. So the other funny thing here is that all the people, the different arguments you just laid out from the many different sources that disagree on, I guess, let's say what the right thing to do is, but what morality is, what's right and what's wrong. They're all saying, I mean, everything they're saying has truth in it, and there's a truth that encompasses all of that. This whole thing about the truth is a different topic, but the part of it that's related to morality is that, and let's take the example of a person who is yelling at someone else disrespectfully. Okay, the person being yelled at um, uh, is thinking that's wrong because you're being disrespectful, but the other person is thinking, no, you need to hear this because you're not, like, it's something you don't know that you have to know now.
Yeah.
And so they're both kind of right, they're both justified, and so it's not really entirely right. And yeah, it's not really entirely right that the person being yelled at would force the other person to stop yelling because they're feeling disrespected. There's something that's also wrong about that because the other person has something to say. Now, personally, I think in a case like this, there's a compromise they can both make. So the person who's yelling, maybe they value, and it's more important to them to communicate a certain message than it is to yell. So maybe they can not yell and speak it, let's say, calmly or in a certain other manner that's not disrespectful, and they get what they want. And so they're happy, they're doing well, they're satisfied with the outcome. And the other person who's receiving the message doesn't get yelled at and is also more receptive to the message, but they don't feel bad about this. And so they don't grow resentful and hateful and angry and bitter, and they don't feel disrespected. Um, and so you can see that, and if, from my perspective, let's say the best result here um, is a compromise, so that each person would get what's so important to them and not get the less important thing. The person yelling does care about yelling because they have some emotion in there they want to let out, right? But it's more important to them to maybe communicate that message. Maybe that's more important to them. and the other person is, and he cares more about being treated with respect than they care about being right, let's say, about the thing they're being yelled at. I hope this example is clear and it's not too vague and ambiguous.
It's very clear, and I think like it got me to think about several things. One, I think it's important to, like when you're seeking the best outcome, it's important to know what's the best action or the best way to treat others in order to get the best outcome. Because you might assume that by yelling, you're asserting dominance or you're displaying power.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, you will get the result that you want. And maybe in the short term, you will get the result that you want, but in the long term, it's actually causing others to distance themselves from you, or it may have other negative consequences. Like there's this uh, like advice, parenting advice. They say if your children lie a lot, it's likely because your punishments are very strict. So they're afraid of getting punished, and so they resort to lying. But the
Mm-hmm.
reason why you're punishing is because you want them to behave in the right way. You see how like the approach, the tactic that you use can backfire and cause unintended consequences. Like you want your children to behave properly, but the way you're actually acting towards them is leading them to develop negative traits, which is lying or keeping secrets, things like that,
Yeah.
or hypocrisy. Like there are so many different consequences as a result of maybe having good intentions, but the approach that you're taking is not like leading to the desired outcome. So understanding what it takes or what is the best way to behave is important. And I don't think it comes to us intuitively. I think it does require some experience. It does require a bit of learning. And also what's really important is to develop the skills of being moral. Just because you want to be moral doesn't mean you will be moral, or you will know, you will act in the right way given the situation. Because sometimes, like for me, sometimes I avoid confrontation because I know if I put myself in a situation where someone is being disrespectful, I might lash out and not be able to control myself. So I've not developed the skill to be fully functional and um, behave in a way that leads to the best outcomes given a particular confrontation. So uh, again, like understanding how, like what is human nature and how best to respond in different situations, and then also develop the skills to be able to do that uh, like in a good way.
Mm-hmm.
Just the last point I would mention is because you mentioned something about the person yelling feeling justified in their yelling because they want to
Mm-hmm.
get a point across. Uh, this brings me to the point of like the distinction between your personal moral code from your vantage point and then um, like a more objective uh, moral code, or like a more holistic moral code, which is not about what you want out of it, but what is the right thing for the entire situation. What's the and what's the right uh, way to treat others? Because just because you feel like you want to get a point across doesn't mean you're justified in behaving in any way you want. Okay, so I think that like uh, that's also very important when it comes to morality, like knowing your boundaries and knowing um, what's best for the situation, not just your point of view.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, big any so the way that I see it, and this I feel like we're kind of circling around this a little bit, where um, you know, morality is like it's you know what? Let me just see what the official definition of morality. Just gonna quickly.
Okay.
So
And if
let's
you
go
can open,
to
sorry, if you
yeah.
can open another tab and check the definition of ethics, because Honestly, I forgot what the distinction between them is, but there might be something useful in it.
So morality is defined on Google as principles concerning the distinction between right and wrong or good and bad behavior. That was my intuition of what it meant. So I'm glad that you know that I'm not so completely off base, but it is about good and bad behavior and telling apart right from wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Ethics is defined here as moral principles that govern a person's behavior or the conducting of an activity. Interesting. Moral principles that govern behavior.
I think
Okay.
ethics is more externalized and maybe like codified. It's like something that people agree on, whereas morality is something that you follow as an individual, maybe.
No, no. So ethics, it's the part about ethics definition that's outside morality is conducting of an activity. The moral principles that govern a person's and govern a conducting of an activity. So like the ethical way of to be a teacher, the ethical code of being a programmer. You know what I mean?
Okay.
So
Yes.
it can be bounded in a certain activity. But morality is principles concerning distinction between good and bad behavior. So it's much more objective and it's much more kind of in the air, I would say.
Okay.
um, so, yani, the way that I see it, that morality is really, really tied to the bottom line of morality is a subjective experience of human beings involved in the picture. Um, and so the way that I see it is that the right way to act, the moral way to be, to exist, is a way that contributes positively to the group without making anybody suffer in the group. So it's about any like if you want to be a moral person, you have to understand where the people around you are coming from, which is an act of compassion and empathy. And it's about understanding maybe what would make them feel hurt, what would make them feel good, what would make them feel bad, and then understanding how you can, and also applying the same thing to yourself. What would make you feel hurt? What would make you feel bad and good, and so on. And then finding, in the case of a single scenario, finding out what you can do, what you should do in that single situation that would make yourself and the people around you have a better experience of life in that moment. Okay. And then if you keep answering that question in a single situation at a time, many times in your life, you'll come across these these principles that seem recurring in so many other situations. Like one thing I personally saw in my personal experience is empathy. It's really important because otherwise you're just being selfish. You have to see the perspective of other people because if you don't, you might accidentally do something that makes them eventually get resentful and hurtful and hateful and angry, and that causes lots of problems. Especially if you have influence or control over some aspect of their lives.
Mm.
And so, to me, um, I started to see empathy or maybe compassion. It's not clear, but empathy in that area as a moral virtue because it's something that I keep seeing commonly where if I keep applying empathy in my life, I keep behaving in a morally good way. I keep doing the right thing, you know?
Okay. But
Um,
how are you defining the right thing?
the right thing is what benefits everyone involved as much as possible and
You
hurts
and
them as less as possible. Yes, including me and the people around me.
okay,
Yeah.
but you mentioned the word selfish. So, by your definition, selfish would be uh, to your benefit, maybe at the expense of others, or um, neglecting the
it's
interests of others.
it's really hard to define selfish, and that's why people disagree a lot on whether it's good to be selfish or bad.
Yeah,
In some ways, I think it's good, but in certain other ways, I think it's bad. So to define selfish, you first have to define self. No one can define self. The whole spiritual people in the world, they're just going crazy over what the self is. The
yeah,
whole psychoanalytic movement is trying to figure out what the self is. And so it's hard to define it. And for good reason, because it's not easy to define what the self is, what the you is that experiences. But so sometimes I'm being selfish when I give a gift to someone I care about. It's a selfish act, but it makes them happy, you know. But sometimes if I'm being selfish, I'm gonna tell them something hurtful just to make them feel bad and go away, you know. And
mm,
so it depends on how you see yourself, and depending on how you see yourself, maybe being selfish is good, maybe being selfish is bad. So I don't think we can put selfishness in, like, I don't think we can say whether selfishness is good or bad until we have some definition of the self and the definition that we agree on.
yeah.
It's difficult to do that, you know.
So, yeah, growing up, I would say like an ongoing theme when it comes to doing the right thing and being moral is that you have to be selfless. So you make sacrifices for other people's sake. And then I read a book by Ayn Rand, um, Ayn Rand, Ayn, Rand, Rand. Uh, and the book is called The Virtue of Selfishness. And actually, Ayn Rand, as a figure, she's a bit problematic. Like she's like controversial because she was very pro-capitalism, and it seemed, and she was very much against like the welfare state and like the state taking responsibility for the poor, things like that. Uh, but I do believe that there's truth to what to what she says about selfishness, um, and she makes it clear that if you want to be like being moral means that you don't sacrifice others for your interest or sacrifice yourself for other people's interest. So like you said, it's to the betterment of all or to the benefit of all, and like you try to maximize that. Um, so in terms of what's a healthy way to be selfish, I do believe it's important to recognize the importance of your own happiness, uh, and also to seek as much as possible to contribute to the happiness of others. Because what tends to happen is some people feel like the right thing for them to do is to make others happy, but they end up neglecting themselves. And when they neglect themselves, I think there are two problems to it. One is you limit the possibilities of you helping others, because if you're neglecting yourself, usually you get drained emotionally, like your energy is drained because you're caring about others without caring for yourself. But the other thing is, like the way I started thinking about it, like when I read Ayn Rand's work, is that, and I experienced this myself. Uh, if you're being selfless, you're trying to make others happy. But those who are being treated well, or like the ones that you want to make happy, if they are not being selfish to receive or to experience that happiness, that means whatever you do is not making them happy, it's making them guilty, because they feel like for them to be happy is being selfish, which means it's immoral. So everyone is chasing after trying to make others happy, but no one is willing to receive that gift because that would make them selfish and therefore immoral. And so everyone's feeling guilty, you know? So I
Yeah,
feel like, no, it's good to be happy and it's good to take care of yourself and try to, as much as you can, to contribute to the lives of others.
exactly. Yeah, yeah, exactly. It's a matter of balance, I would say. It's a matter of balance.
Yeah,
um
and I think not just balance, it's to recognize that uh, making others happy doesn't compromise your happiness. It can actually uh, help you experience happiness. Like you said, like when you give someone a gift, sometimes you experience that joy in giving, not in the receiving. You feel
Mhm.
like that. I think the sense of empathy kicks in. Like you can feel the joy that they're experiencing.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
There was a really interesting like exercise that was done in a workshop, and I feel like it like expresses the importance of like contributing to the lives of others. Basically, like a room is filled with uh, balloons, and each balloon has the name of one of the participants. Okay,
Hmm.
let's say there are 40 participants, and then first you tell them each participant should find their own balloon. Okay, so
Okay.
everyone scrambles to find their own balloon, but it can take quite a while because you have 40 balloons, and like uh, they all look the same, and you have to like figure out which one's your balloon, and then the balloons keep on moving, so it becomes challenging. But then instead of that approach, you ask each person to give the balloon they find to the person whose name is on the balloon. Okay, so that way, whenever you find a balloon, it has a name. You go to the person and say, "This is your balloon." Okay, very quickly, people coordinate and collaborate for each person to find their balloon. Okay, so even if you weren't the one that found the balloon, somebody helped you find the balloon for you. So
Hmm.
what I like about it is that the shift in perspective, helping others find their balloon, doesn't take away from your own happiness. You know?
Exactly. And the thing about that experiment is that in that case, I can see how it's a matter of a balancing act, because you can see that in a situation like that, um, you want to like balance out, let's say, your happiness with other people's happiness. In that case, imagine how much effort you're saving the other person by just giving them their balloon that you just found. It's really easy to give it to them, but it's a lot harder for them to find it. And
Yeah,
so in a situation like that, um, I guess you could say the right thing to do would be to give someone a balloon if you find it, because it's benefiting the group overall. Sure, it's gonna cost you a little bit to find who that person is, to call out their name, and to hand them the balloon, and maybe to walk over to where they are and hand them the balloon. But you're saving them a lot of time, and so that's you know that's that's kind of the pattern that's very recurring throughout our lives. It's if it's easy to give to someone else and it makes them feel so much better, that's, I guess you could say, that's the right thing to do. But that's a good behavior. It's a good thing to do. It's a moral act.
yeah,
And so the thing with sorry, the thing with empathy here is that especially when it was a selfish thing to do to give someone a gift. Um, that happened after I started to learn that the well-being of the group I'm in does contribute greatly to my own well-being. And
yeah,
so, and because I myself wanted to feel better about myself and about my life in general, I realized that the thing I could do that could have a large impact on my well-being is to honestly give to the group and to make them happier. Um, and to contribute to the well-being of the group. Because then again, it's like I'm planting more abundance, planting more seeds that's bearing lots of uh, uh, fruit across time.
yeah,
And you could, with a shift in frame and perspective, you could allow yourself to behave selfishly sometimes while still it being a good behavior,
yeah.
you know?
I actually don't think there should be a dichotomy between selfish and selfless. Like uh, helping others uh, can and should improve their lives and improve your life. Like just because you have something to gain from it doesn't mean it's a bad thing. And as long as you're not being manipulative about it, it's not that you're giving a gift with strings attached. That would be, I think manipulation or exploitation, which is not a good
Mhm.
thing, because um, you're really being self-obsessed and you're just using this as a tool to get what you want. But genuinely feeling happy for other people, genuinely looking to contribute to their happiness, I think is a good thing. No matter how much joy you derive out of it, the more the better. It's not like, oh, I'm sure you've come across this. Like you do a job and then or an activity that you say, I want to be paid for it. They say, yeah, but you enjoy it. Like, why should I pay you if you enjoy it? That's beside the point, you know? Like, some people say, oh, okay, yeah, you gave me a gift, but you also enjoyed giving it to me. So it's not really selfless. Like, I feel like there's this unhealthy obsession with sacrifice, even like with the love. Like, it's not how can we spend our lives together happily? Like, prove to me that you will make the sacrifice. Like, no, why do we need these sacrifices to prove love? You know?
But so one thing you said just now is that um, and yeah, so one thing I want to add to that is what, what was it? You said how um, about giving isn't it doesn't have to be a selfish thing, but it can be about the person giving and the person you're giving to, and that you're giving gift to someone that makes them happy. You should feel happy too. The um, so sometimes that does work out where someone else being happy makes you happy too, but that's because you like that person. It's because you like that person. You want to see them happy, but that's not always true. Sometimes the other person is not someone you particularly like. Maybe you don't want to see them smile sometimes. In cases like that, um, in, in cases like that, giving them a gift from your heart isn't morally good because it's going to lead to bad results because they might use that against you and hurt you even more, right? So in cases like that, it's not necessarily a good idea to maybe give them a gift from the heart and try to make them happy, but the situation changes completely because it's like an adversarial relationship here. In a case like that, uh, the moral act would be to try and bridge the gap and to try and right the wrongs that happened in the past between the two of you. And maybe it's an attempt to establish trust as opposed to establish happiness. So even that act of giving gifts, it's pretty contextual and situational, you know.
Yeah.
It's not a code that's always right. Sometimes that same code in a similar situation, slightly different, would be not a good thing to do, you know.
Yeah. I completely agree. And I think I've actually experienced this a few times where I feel like people try to make amends, like uh, somebody did something wrong and they want, like the other party wants to go past it. So they say, let's reach out and forget uh, anything ever happened. But I feel like evading what has happened sometimes is a way to avoid maybe difficult conversations, but conversations that need to be had, you know? Because like if somebody is being careless or is being hurtful and you don't acknowledge it, you just like your gift to them, to get to use your example, is like a peace offering, but it's not, it doesn't help encourage them to acknowledge the hurt that they did, or it doesn't help them change the way they're behaving. So in that way, it's like it's being, I would say, evasive. Like you're pretending something that an issue that does exist doesn't exist, which I think usually it perpetuates or amplifies the problems rather than help resolve them. Um, so, like you said, I think for the most part, morality is contextual, or like you would have to consider the circumstances. A single act can be both good or bad, depending on the situation or depending on the intention.
Hmm. Hmm. So then I'm gonna just throw this question at you. Do you feel now that morality is subjective or objective at this point?
I believe we can't escape the fact that there is a subjective experience to morality, but
Hmm.
I do believe there's an objective code. I wouldn't say absolutist. So absolutism would be uh, this act is right regardless of circumstances. I don't believe this to be true about morality. I do believe morality is contextual, but it's objectively contextual. So any person experiencing the same circumstances uh, would be justified in behaving in a certain way. Okay? And morality is dependent on the proper understanding of human nature and the people, the individuals you're interacting with. So, for example, let's say a person that maybe you have the best of intentions, but a person went through a relationship or an experience where they were being manipulated, they may not respond favorably to a gift, for example, because they're linking it to their own experience. So in that case, you have to be like intelligent enough to acknowledge what they went through and then how they will interpret your gesture, like in terms of giving a gift. So I do believe it's very important to understand human nature, to understand the people that you interact with, and then be skillful enough to respond in the best way possible. I do think skill is a big part of being moral. We get better at being moral.
Yeah, so I completely agree that it has an objective element to it, and I think because of that objective element that we can resolve conflict. We can resolve conflict and differences um, by talking, by communicating.
Yeah,
Um, and and if that wasn't true, the world would never be a good place to live in ever. It would just be
yeah,
constant warfare between every two human beings. But because there's an objectivity to morality, that we can resolve differences and codify principles that help us avoid those conflicts in the future and help us to resolve them if we ever come across them. But the subjective element of the whole picture is that you can't just say this thing is good or this thing is bad and expect it to be applied um, just immediately to the whole world.
yeah,
And because it applies differently to every person and to every situation. So the moral code or the moral principles have to be somewhat high level and abstract. They have to be not so concrete because they have to be flexible enough to be applicable in different situations and uh, with different people. And the thing I like about it is that it has to be kind of decentralized. Like you can't have a figure of authority that says this is right, this is wrong, and you have to do what they say because they have to know what's happening in the situation and every single situation, and every single situation is really really different. So um,
okay.
uh,
But here's the thing. Sorry, you wanted to add something?
yeah, um, you, the person who's involved in a conflict with someone else, you have to take those moral principles and apply them in the situation with the person you're kind of having the conflict with. And that's how you can resolve differences using morality. That's kind of where the objectivity of morality comes uh, from. But the subjectivity is that it's related to your personal experience of life. It's related to your past as well, you know?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay. So the way I think of it is you have abstract principles and then concrete situations. But if you take all concrete situations to be absolutely unique, like we can't really compare two concrete situations together, that means you can never apply abstract principles because, because you can't make these generalizations. I would say it is possible to make generalizations about concrete situations as long as the relevant variables are the same. Meaning, a person's height doesn't have an impact on how they should behave. You know, like in the vast majority of cases, your height is not a relevant variable. Even your past experience, it may lead you to act in a certain way. Going back to the point of skillfulness, like if a person is abused in their childhood, they may resort to abuse. Like the saying goes, hurt people, hurt people. So there is a possibility of people causing hurt because of their background, but this doesn't justify their behavior in this situation. We can maybe forgive them because it's more difficult for them to behave morally than others. But again, like the moral principle would still apply. This is how you should do it. This is how you should not do it. I think you touched on another really important point, which is like the decentralized sort of meaning of morality. And I would attribute this to your own personal convictions, because I think if you're being told what to do and you're not convinced, it doesn't lead to moral action. It leads to coercion or control. Somebody is trying to control the way you behave. But morals should be a choice. If you're not making that choice, then it's not a moral action. And there's this point of if you threaten people to behave like to behave a certain way, and if they don't, they get punished, then the action that they take is not considered moral, it's considered amoral, because they no longer have the choice to make.
Exactly. Yeah.
They're not free to make that choice. So an important part of being moral and encouraging morality is to actually encourage the reasoning that goes behind the morals, and to persuade others to act in the way that you believe is right. It's not forcing them to act in that way. It's you explaining the reasoning and then giving them the choice to act in that way.
Yeah, so there's something practical about not forcing someone to behave a certain way. So the the practical part about this, the reason that that the person has to choose on their own free will to act morally, otherwise it's not a moral act, that doesn't count as moral or immoral, it's amoral, which means it's not good or bad, it's neither, it's not their choice, is that if so if I do something that's not, if I, someone who wants to do the good thing, the right thing, if I don't do the right thing, there's a reason. It might not be something obvious and clear to everyone else, but deep down on some level, there's a reason. And so if you tell me to do that, what I'm doing isn't the right thing, and you tell me what the right thing is, and I still don't do it, that means the right thing you gave me, it doesn't take into account something powerful inside me. And so then if you try and force me to act in the right way, it's not actually the right way. It's what you think is the right way. There's a difference. It's not actually the right way. It's only what you think is the right way. And in a situation like that, if you knew the whole picture, if you knew everything about what hurts me inside, let's say, then that right thing to do will change, will be something different. Is this making sense?
Yes.
So this is kind of why it's decentralized. This is kind of why it's decentralized. And this actually touches on something you said earlier. I don't remember the exact phrasing you mentioned, but uh, it's about how in different situations the variables that matter are known, and that's how you can Is that right? Is that what you said?
Relevant. So you take into account
Relevant.
the
Yeah.
relevant variables.
Yeah.
Like
So
that some variables to a situation uh, don't change what the moral guideline would be. Like, you know, for example, I actually noticed this a lot within politics
mhm.
because a lot of people would give an opinion about a certain country. And then when the same thing happens in their country, they're like, no, but that's different. Okay. And the reason why they say it is because they're maybe emotionally tied uh, to their own situation, or maybe they take into account uh, additional variables that really don't impact the outcome of what makes good or bad, you know?
And okay, so if they were just emotionally tied, that just makes it a different problem entirely. It makes it a lower uh, problem. But and the case of the relevant uh, variables, the problem with that is that if you look at a situation from the outside, let's say why a bully is bullying a child, let's say,
Mhm.
um, and let's say that the bullying itself is they're slapping them in the face, something like that, something aggressive like that. Morally speaking, that's the wrong thing to do, obviously. Um, but 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 the main problem here is that you don't really know what the variables that matter. So abstractly, if you know all the variables that matter or all of the relevant variables, then the same moral code applies in every situation where the same relevant variables are at play. But in reality, uh, every single thing that happened in your past ever is a relevant variable. And it might not be a very significant variable, but it does matter. And
Okay.
in cases where you can like objectify the situation and take the relevant variables, or as I say, the most significant relevant variables, you're not taking into account the less significant one. And most of the time that works, that's okay, because the people in the picture, they take care of the less significant, less impactful factors. Um, and so they take care of them so that it doesn't complicate the situation. You know what I mean? But
Okay, let's
those
go
are
back.
still important. Those are still part of the picture.
Let's go back to the example of bullying. So
Yeah.
a child is being bullied. What do you think are the relevant factors?
Uh, why so the bully? Why is what's compelling them to bully? What do they feel bad about? What do they feel good about? What do they think is acceptable behavior? Not what the right thing is. It's really abstract for, let's say, a child. But what do they think is an okay behavior to have? How do they learn that? You know?
Okay. Okay. So this is when you say relevant, I would say it's relevant in that it's playing a role within the situation in causing the situation. The reason why this this child is bullying another child is because they feel justified. They themselves are being abused. They see weakness in the other child and they feel like they need to do something about it. It's frustrating them. Okay. These are factors that led to the situation. But in terms of the situation itself, what makes it moral or what makes it immoral, all the reasoning that leads a bully to bully would be considered irrelevant because no matter what the cause is, the action is not justified. You're crossing a boundary which you're meant to respect, in that a person should not be subjected to abuse or violence. Okay? So again, the
Mhm.
situation of it would not change the fact.
Right, right,
Okay?
right.
This is what I mean. Now, I do see something which is, and it's something that I would like to discuss with you as well. Um, there's this idea that understanding or explaining is justifying. So if you were to ask what led the bully to do this, it's as though you're saying it's okay for the bully to do it. And I think this is like, it's a really important distinction to make, that understanding is not justifying, and just explaining what caused it is also not justifying. So like, I feel like there's an important conversation to be had to avoid immoral action. Like to help stop bullying, you need to look at the causes of bullying and to address those. But taking that approach doesn't mean that you're actually justifying bullying whenever it happens. It's still wrong, but we need to understand it so we can fix it.
Interesting.
Yeah,
You're right.
and
You're right.
because the point that I wanted to discuss with you is about racism, because we talk now about like not forcing beliefs on others, and morality is about convincing others. But if a person is a racist, okay, and the expression that I'm seeing is racism is not an opinion. If a person is being a racist and they're causing harm and hurt to others, what's the moral action, or what's the right response to a racist?
Okay, well, for someone who's outside this racist interaction between the racist and the person being discriminated against racially, is to not educate necessarily, but to see what's motivating the racist in being racist and discriminatory that way, and then figuring out how to get them to stop, but not by forcing them or controlling them, but trying to maybe get them to see that what they're doing is wrong, and it's better for everyone if they stop being racist. You know, I guess that would be it.
But if education doesn't work, what's the stance?
Well, you have to ask, why is it not working? If we're telling them that it's wrong, showing them it's wrong, but they're still being racist, what's really motivating them here?
Okay. Because the way I like to think of it, and I like the way that you brought to attention the fact of being an outsider.
It's important.
Yeah, me personally, like one of the things that drive my moral outlook, I actually call it like vampire morality. Not in that I tap blood, but there's a myth around vampires that they won't enter your house unless you give them permission to do so. Okay? So, like once you give them the permission, then they will sort of trespass, or not trespass. Like they will have access to your house. The way I treat morals is that I try to respect people's boundaries as much as possible, and I don't offer advice to individuals like you should do this, you should do that. If they ask me for advice, I would give it to them. Okay. So respecting people's boundaries and respecting the fact that I'm not going through what they're going through, so I can't really judge how I would behave in a similar situation. Like, it's very easy for me to say, no, you know what you should do? You shouldn't fight back. You should educate them. Okay, I'm not experiencing the oppression that they're experiencing, so I can't really offer that as advice, you know? So as long as I'm not experiencing the situation, I really can't advise people on how they should behave. The second point is, I do believe education is important and helping people to abandon dangerous ideas or abandon dangerous values. So a racist, I would like to help show them that racism is wrong. But then the third factor is, you don't really need to convince a racist not to oppress others. You should make it law, or you should make acting on racism punishable. Because no matter what your views are in terms of like your race or other races, these views, keep them to yourself. If these views cause you to transgress against others, the law does not allow you to do so. So that's where you like, and the person being oppressed does have the right to fight back, does have the right to self-defense. So it's not just education. It's not, we can't just be at the mercy of someone else's way of thinking. You can actually protect your own rights through the law and through the action that you take in retaliation.
So, as a so there's a couple of problems here. The first is when you include the law, that's when things start to get really complicated, because then the first question is, what's the fair and appropriate punishment? And second thing is, what makes you think that what you think is the right punishment is the right punishment? You could be wrong. You could be overdoing it, and that will only fuel the hatred and the racist people. The second thing, you said something on the other side, yeah, that the person being discriminated against would have the right to fight back to protect themselves. That's good to protect themselves, but once you give permission for someone to fight back, again, there has to be some boundaries. There has to be some moral boundaries over how much you fight back. Killing someone by just saying you have the wrong skin, that might be too much, you know? And so those things, while they address the problem that's happening now, they might be creating other problems, which it's important to keep those kind of in check and carefully bounded, you know?
Yeah, but the thing is, I do believe education is important, and like addressing ideas, like showing people why their ideas are wrong. But at the same time, you can't expect the oppressed to rely only on this, to rely only on educating others, because otherwise, like I know there's a challenge with defining fair laws, but if there is no law to deter people from actually stepping their bounds and causing harm to others, that means the absence of law is benefiting the oppressor and not the oppressed. So
yeah,
you know,
so notice the first thing notice that when you asked me what I think the right thing to do is, I didn't say anything about what I would do for the oppressed. I didn't mention that because I myself, let's say in terms of racism, I've never been oppressed racially. So I don't know what I can do to help them. I can give them, let's say, kindness, maybe safety if I can afford that, but I don't know how I can really help them because I don't know their experience. So it's really hard to contribute in that way, especially if you don't really know what their experience is like, because you could accidentally make things worse, you know?
yeah.
And yeah, I don't know if promising them education for the people there that are oppressing them is going to make them feel any better. I don't know. But the thing is that, so the problem with racism here that in terms of my moral decisions about it, that I try to avoid is, the question is, so at the end of the day, at the bottom line, we are at the end of the day social creatures.
Mm-hmm.
And what that means is we work together to protect ourselves and our group against let's say a common enemy, let's say. But the point is, but the point is that we work together, you know, and what that means is that we're vulnerable to each other. If we protect ourselves from everyone else all the time, we're not going to have any energy to do anything at all. So we have to find a way to live together and be vulnerable to each other and be okay with that. That has to happen. Okay. And so how do you be vulnerable with other people and feel safe that they're not going to hurt you? The best solution is that they will just not hurt you. And so ideally, the ideal solution is to make sure that we all actually love each other and not want to hurt each other, because we realize that it's better for us to be on the same side as everyone else. And in reality, we actually are on the same side. If anybody thinks that we're not, they're actually wrong. It's not that they're seeing things differently. No, they're actually wrong. We are, at the end of the day, human beings on the same side. Like all human beings have more in common than they have in difference. So we're actually more together than we are apart. But someone who is a racist who thinks these groups of people have to go away, they're technically wrong. They're actually wrong. It's not that they're doing something we don't like. It's that they're actually wrong, because they're better off having them there, and working with them. So ideally, it's preferred, if possible, that anyone who can be racist chooses not to be racist, and instead chooses to connect and to to connect with the people that they're currently discriminating against. That's ideal. Now, of course, this does not touch on history of discrimination and how the oppressed can heal. I'm not going anywhere near that. That's a whole other topic I am not qualified to touch on at all.
Yeah. No, but again, I do think relying solely, ideally, you want to educate people and make them realize that they should abandon racism or any form of sort of discrimination or ways of justifying oppression towards others. But if that education doesn't work, it doesn't mean that the oppressed should continue to be oppressed. They can actually either fight back or have laws that protect their rights. Now, the problem with the laws is if they don't address the cultural change that needs to happen, you can't rely solely on the law, because people will break the law or find ways to not be punished by the law. But again, it doesn't mean that the oppressor should be justified or should not be deterred in any way.
Of course, yeah. So, of course, I can imagine how some oppressors would not stop oppressing, even if you do your best to teach them, to connect with them, to help them, and to show them that they shouldn't. In cases like that, then a different approach, a less kind approach, must be better. Maybe some kind of protection, like a law, would be better. But I give that as my first answer because I think that's the best first response. At least you should try it out. Like in my case, I haven't ever been oppressed racially. Yeah, I don't think I've ever once in my life been oppressed racially, but I've been oppressed in other ways. And I've been like seriously oppressed in other ways. And my response, I mean, I've tried different things, but the best response that has had the best impact on me personally as the oppressed has been a empathetic response with my oppressors. An empathetic response to understand where they're coming from. And the best effort I had that made the biggest impact was to really understand what's compelling them to oppress me in different ways, and to help them solve that problem. Then they wouldn't have the need to come after me, you know?
Yeah.
And to me, that has had the biggest impact in improving my life. And then while they still are able to do the same thing they did before, they just don't. And I have a better life this way, you know?
Nice. I was actually having this conversation today about who deserves your respect, or is respect given or is it earned? And I'm of the opinion that you should treat everyone with respect. And usually those who have oppressive tendencies would actually back down. Like whenever, in many situations, when they feel like they're being acknowledged or they're being treated respectfully, they find it hard to oppress those who are respecting them, because there is some sort of power play, and usually respecting others helps them be better people. Like the way, I believe you shouldn't treat people the way they are. You should treat them the way they can be. So that's what encourages them to be better people.
Interesting.
Yeah. By the way, we kind of skipped. I mean, we passed the 1 hour mark.
Yes, we have. Yes, we have. We can
Well,
wrap
there are
this
a
up
few
here.
things, yeah, there are a few other things I wanted to touch on, but
Yes, yes. Yeah, yeah.
so I'd like to wrap up.
Yep, yep. That's. Do you want to take the lead in wrapping this present?
I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you very much. I think it's an important question to ask ourselves: what is morality, and how can we best be moral, not just as an intellectual exercise, but actually also exploring ways we can cultivate the skills of being moral. And one thing I noticed, and I'd also like to share, is the distinction between the golden rule and what I call the gold-plated rule. The golden rule tells us to treat others the way we would like to be treated. But most of us live with the gold-plated rule, which is we treat others the way they treat us. So whenever someone is bad to us, we retaliate in kind. And this leads to a downward spiral where we feel justified in the bad actions of others and we perpetuate those bad actions. But we shouldn't take those who oppress us or those who hurt us as our role models. We should actually set a better example for them to encourage them to act with kindness, empathy, and respect.
Yep,
That's what I
yep.
would say.
It was a good conversation. I really enjoyed the whole thing. I really enjoyed the whole conversation.
Me too. And I
All right.
look forward to a few more.
Likewise, likewise. Thank you.
Take care. Speak to you soon.